Hi everyone, this is Suzanne Simon with Restore America's Estuaries. We're going to go ahead and get underway. It looks like we've got a nice group of people here. So first of all, let me say thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to be here for our monthly virtual gathering of the Living Shorelines Community of Practice. I will formally introduce them in a little bit. We are delighted to be talking about living shorelines implementation in coastal Alabama. So, for those of you who may not be familiar with Restore America's Estuaries, we are a national 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the protection, restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. As you can see here, we have 10 member organizations around the country. If you would like to, for some reason, get in touch with any of them, please let me know, and I am happy to connect you. So before we get too deep into the agenda, I just wanted everybody to be aware that everybody is on mute. We will be going around the country. If folks want to give a regional update, use the control panel that you should have within your webinar software to raise your hand, or you can also submit a question, and I can either read it on your behalf or I can unmute you. So that is a way of keeping everything quiet for the rest of the participants. So on that note, I will go ahead and do a quick national update. So I think many of you are hopefully aware we have our 2018 Restore America's Estuaries Coastal States Organization Summit coming up in December in Long Beach. Poster opportunities are still available. And on the Living Shorelines front, we are going to have a very robust track of presentations and posters. There are poster opportunities still available. And for those of you who have submitted something, notifications will be going out with date, time, room information this month. So hang tight. We're still finalizing all the details on that front. So just know that that's definitely in the works. The other national update that I have on the Living Shorelines front, we are still planning on the national workshop for fall of 2019. I'm going to let the cat a little bit out of the bag. We're aiming for coastal North Carolina, which obviously was rather substantially impacted. So I will be following up with the potential venues to make sure they're still there and able to host next year. Anyhow, just know that that is underway, so stay tuned for that. So I am going to go ahead and open it up. If anybody has anything else on the national scale they would like to share, please raise your virtual hand from within the webinar software, and then we will work our way around the regions. Any hands for national updates? Okay, seeing none, I will go ahead. Let's start in the Pacific Northwest. If anybody has any updates, raise your hand virtually or submit an email, a question through or comment through the software. Great Lakes. We're going to go clockwise around the country here today. Great Lakes. Northeast. Let's call that New York to Maine and our Canadian friends. All right. Mid-Atlantic. Any updates? Southeast. Oh, okay. Bill Shadle has his hand up. Bill, go ahead and give an update.
Sure. I just thought this might be of interest. It's not all living shorelines, but the Corps of Engineers, I just went to 2 public meetings over the past couple months for, say, New York Harbor down through Delaware on the coast. The Corps of Engineers in New York District is doing one called, it's like the Harbors and Tributaries Study. The Philadelphia District is doing New Jersey Back Bays Study. And they're both essentially in response to Hurricane Sandy, looking at, it's in the feasibility or even pre-feasibility. I'm not sure what level it is at the moment, actually. Yeah, I think it's pre-feasibility. Looking at ways to protect communities along the coast and in these back bays from storm surges and other issues, including nuisance flooding. And in their suite of considerations at the moment are natural-based features such as living shorelines. It's all very preliminary, but it might be of interest to folks on this call. Again, it's coming out of New York District and the Philadelphia District, two different studies, similar in their purpose. And they're looking at some big things like closing off inlets with surge protectors, walling off entire shorelines and things like that. But these are all very conceptual at this time. But again, they're considering natural-based features along with it. Even just to chime in on it, it might be interesting to this group. So that's it.
So, hey, Bill, this is Suzanne. So is the point trying to figure out how to best address flooding? I think I missed something along the way. I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. So these are all post-Sandy projects, and they're to address flooding, storm surge. So it's from nuisance flooding. It sounds like they're considering all the way up through storm surge issues, which are approached differently as far as solutions.
Gotcha. And are they looking to perhaps take these as pilots and do other research, or is this specifically in kind of the New York Harbor, Philly area?
Yeah, it stretches from sort of New York Harbor, and the two studies sort of overlap, New York Harbor, or they meet, south through, I think, into Delaware as well. So it's looking at it as a large scale project to protect these communities and these shorelines. And I wouldn't say it's like a demonstration at all, not yet. I mean, they might spin off smaller projects from this, but right now it's a large scale study for a host of things that are going to cost a ton of money.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering if they were going to use this as a template for other regions of the country, but it doesn't sound like that. This is region specific.
Oh, yeah. Well, that I don't know. It's possible. That didn't come up, but I don't see why they wouldn't look at it that way.
Okay. Cool. Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okie dokie. So that was kind of the Mid-Atlantic area. We'll head down to the southeast. Any updates? Again, going clockwise around the country. Anybody in the Gulf of Mexico? Presenters notwithstanding. All right, and then we'll go to the Pacific Southwest. I see a lot of California people on. Aha, here we go. We have someone from the Gulf. Deba Bibu with Coalition Restore Coast Louisiana. Go ahead.
Hi, I am here with a colleague, Katie Denman, also today, and we are getting ready to deploy a small living shorelines with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian community. This will be to protect a mound complex from erosion, and it's a more community-based, smaller project using about 200 tons of oyster shell. And we're also moving along with a larger project for the Barataria Bay that'll be sometime in 2019. So we have also resumed volunteer events for the year. Although it still hasn't cooled down. So that's where, yeah, that's what's on our plate currently.
That's great. And when you say mounds, are those middens? Because I've heard them called middens as well. So in other words, it's archaeologically and historical importance to the tribe.
Yeah, I think that there's, it's one of these areas where there's like multiple different types of important features. So I think some are middens, like there might be like, pottery or other things associated with it. And we're trying to protect the privacy of the tribe. So we're not like putting out there everything involved, or we don't even know everything that's in those mounds.
Fair enough. That makes complete sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And then Kate, oh yeah, and I just wanted to introduce Katie really quick. She's our restoration associate. Do you want to say hello, Katie? Oh, you did? Okay. Sorry, she already introduced herself last one. I forgot.
That's great. We always like to welcome new people to our gang, so that's great. Well, thanks for the
Okay.
update, Deb. Appreciate it. Okie dokie. So the Gulf. Any folks from Pacific Southwest and the islands, California? All right. Going once, going twice. All right. If you do have an update later, something comes to you, you have an epiphany, your coffee's kicked in, whatever it is, you want to talk later, that's fine too. So remember that you can reach out in multiple ways. All righty. So I am now delighted to introduce our focus topic, which is synthesizing a decade of living shoreline implementation in coastal Alabama. This is going to be a twofer, folks. We have Jacob Blandford and Brittany Blomberg, who will be talking about their efforts. We're going to start with Jacob, who is the Coastal Conservation Specialist for the Nature Conservancy in Alabama. So I went ahead and passed around their full bios. If you are on this email, you can go back and look at that. We are delighted, though, to have them both. And with that, I am going to kick it off to Jacob to introduce it. Take it away, Jacob.
Hello, everyone. This is Jacob. Thank you for joining us today. Like Suzanne mentioned, we'll be talking about kind of the decade of living shoreline implementation in coastal Alabama. So there are quite a few living shorelines in Mobile Bay. They've been implemented by Dauphin Island Sea Lab, by the Nature Conservancy, by Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, among other people and organizations in the area. And this map here doesn't even show all of them. These are just this is going to show the projects that were included in the data synthesis. These projects were chosen partially because they had monitoring data. It wasn't always consistent as far as when it was collected, how long it was collected, or what was collected, but there was quite a bit of overlap between these projects. They kind of range in time from 2005, I believe was the first one, which was Alonzo Landing down there at the south of the map. And then the most recent one, I believe, was Pelican Point on the eastern side, which was 2014. And what the monitoring included kind of oyster growth and settlement, as well as mussels and other bivalves that colonize the reef. There was some monitoring done for the fish population around the reefs, as well as monitoring shoreline position and erosion over time. And so these living shorelines also had a kind of suite of technologies that were used to build the living shoreline. So kind of from loose shell or bagged shell reef block, which is a rebar frame with these plastic bags that were then filled with oyster shell. Then you get into some concrete technology like the reef balls, the oyster domes, oyster castles, the wave attenuation devices like the concrete pyramids, and the HESCO cages, which were a metal gabion basket that were then filled with rock. And what we wanted to do with this project then was kind of get a comprehensive understanding of the success of the different technologies to help determine what worked where and what it worked for, and then help use this information to guide future projects. And so it was evaluation of the physical, the biological, and the socioeconomic impacts of the 12 living shoreline projects that were on that map. And then from that evaluation, we could then identify the most promising strategies for ensuring future investments and maximizing ecological and societal benefits. And with that, I will pass it over to Brittany for a deeper dive into the kind of synthesis of the data.
All right, thanks, Jacob. So I'm going to go a little bit into the project results. And so as Jacob mentioned, we had lots of different types of data collected by multiple groups over the course of the past, 10 to 15 years since these projects were implemented. So in addition to the biological and physical things related to living shorelines, we also had project partners involved in looking at the societal and economic aspects of these projects. So the density of oysters, mussels, and oyster drills were quantified for 10 of these 12 projects. And we found that oyster density is highest on oyster shell reefs compared to other reef types. And this, supports prior evidence that oyster shells, oysters are attracted to oyster shells. And we saw the highest densities at these bag shell reefs. You can see here the adults and the spats, individuals per meter squared. And then next was the caged shell, which includes those reef block structures, and then loose shell, which was piles of oyster shell. We found that oyster drills really preferred the loose shell. And so the drill density was much higher on these loose shell reefs compared to all the other types. And correspondingly, you can see that the adult oyster live to dead ratio was much lower. So we were experiencing higher predation on oysters by drills at these loose shell reefs. And we also found that in coastal Alabama, we were having some issues with these reef blocks. So many of you are familiar with this method where you put these oyster shells within the plastic bags, just as you would for, bagged shell reefs. And then you put them in the water, and the idea is that oysters are going to recruit and encrust these structures. However, we were finding at many of the projects that included this method that after a couple of years, our cages were looking almost as empty as they started. So we were seeing a lot of dissolution of shell or breaking up of the shell. And so we had a lot of theories as to why this was happening. Unfortunately, none of them were, planned in the monitoring, so we don't really have any data to back this up. We have started some adaptive management strategies to try to figure some of this out. So Jacob and the rest of the Nature Conservancy team is still monitoring these projects. We recently filled one section of one of these reefs. We filled the center compartments of the cages with rock, concrete, oyster shell to try to figure out if maybe just the increase in surface area of these panels was causing increased dissolution of the shell just physically by the water energy, and maybe if filling those compartments will prevent that. One of the other things that kept coming up is that we were getting some stone crabs in these bags, and then they would kind of hide out there for a while, grow to the point where they could not get out of the bag, and so they were just kind of chomping on these shells and breaking them down. That was one of the other commonly discussed theories as well. So we'd be happy to hear from you all about your experiences with these reef blocks. I know here in Texas, there have been a couple projects that have been really successful with these. So moving on to finfish and mobile invertebrates, these were quantified at the reefs for 6 of the 12 projects. And at these 6 projects, this was a pretty intensive effort. Samples were collected monthly at most of these projects, both by gill nets, 2 sizes, 5 centimeter and 10 centimeter gill nets, and then also with these seines to capture some of the more residential species. We found, of course, that the catch per unit effort was highly variable by the site, by the reef type, and by the taxonomic group. Here's one example from 2 of the projects looking at loose shell reefs, and you can see that with the 5 centimeter and the 10 centimeter gill net, we're getting variable densities based on the control and the loose shell. Here's another example at 2 other projects where we're looking at bag shells, reef blocks, and reef balls. And you can see that the cyanid fishes were really attracted to these bag shell reefs compared to the other types of reefs and compared to other taxonomic groups. Overall, we were seeing that the highest nectin densities via seine and via gillnet were both at the loose shell reefs, and then the lowest densities from both sampling methods, again, were at the bagged shell reefs. This was for all taxonomic groups together. And then we also saw variation in species diversity, with the highest at Point of Pines, located in Mississippi Sound, just to the west of Mobile Bay, and then the lowest species diversity was consistently found at Helenwood Park, which is up to the north of Mobile Bay. We had shoreline position data for 10 of the 12 projects. And again, we were finding variable rates of shoreline erosion across projects and reef types. So we took all of the data to look at the total shoreline. We were getting an annual rate of change pre-restoration of 1.6 meters erosion per year. Post-restoration for all of the projects combined, that changed to an erosion rate of 1.35 meters per year. So we're seeing not necessarily a reduction, not necessarily a reverse in the effect, but we are seeing a reduction in the rate of erosion. And if we look at the difference between the reef designs, so one of the things that we did in the synthesis is split up these technologies between engineered and natural. So natural included the bagged shell and the loose shell reef, and engineered included any of those technologies that had, a large human component. So these reef block cages with that fixed, rebar height, the concrete domes, the reef balls, the oyster castles, those were all considered an engineered category. And what we found was that if we split up the restoration effect on the shoreline by these two reef categories, we were seeing a much bigger effect of these natural reefs. And this was quite surprising, considering that we did notice, particularly with the loose shell reefs, some spreading over time, and even the bagged shell reefs, some of those bags would split apart, and we would get some spreading over time. So the height of the natural reefs did decrease over time, whereas these engineered structures, the cages, the reef balls were, stayed at a fixed height in the water column, and we did not see a positive effect on erosion for those. So for us, this kind of indicates that oysters do matter in terms of helping to control erosion and wave energy, because we were getting much higher oyster densities on these natural reefs. And, our reef blocks and our reef balls were getting very low densities. So even though that height was maintained, the lack of complexity from the oysters was probably also contributing to effects on wave energy. So in our analysis of all these data, the shorelines were split up into transects at every 5 meters or every 1 meter, depending on the shoreline length of the project. So we wanted to look at the rates of change at these individual transects. And so again, combining all of the projects and all the reef types, we saw that pre-restoration, 95% of these individual transects were showing an erosion trend. And then post-restoration, that decreased to 78%. So we saw that 17% of our transects have switched trends. So we are seeing some positive effects of these living shorelines on shoreline erosion rates. And anecdotally, we are seeing some success in the field. So we have a picture here of a bagged shell reef on the left, and you can see the piling up of sediment on that shoreward side of the reef. And then we're also noticing some patches of marsh emerging in front of these reefs as well. And so as I mentioned, we had some social surveys that have been conducted in the area related to homeowner decision making. And one of the interesting things to come out of this work was that there were some misperceptions about environmental impacts and the cost effectiveness of these different shoreline protection strategies. And so when talking to homeowners, natural shoreline protection strategies were commonly recognized as the most aesthetically pleasing, but the least effective, the least durable, and requiring the most maintenance. As most of us know, doing this living shoreline research, that these projects can be very effective, very durable, and require minimal amounts of maintenance when they're put in a good spot for living shoreline. And so there is a preference for natural approaches among coastal landowners, but there is this negative side effect of neighbors' hardened shorelines, creating this domino effect. So if your neighbor has a seawall, even if you would prefer a natural shoreline protection method, you're most likely going to kind of be forced into choosing a seawall just because of those negative side effects caused by your neighbor's hardened shoreline are going to increase the erosion on your shoreline. So we're seeing as soon as one person puts in a shoreline seawall, we're seeing a lot of people kind of follow suit. We're also looking at ecosystem service valuations and other economic impacts. Two of the largest projects in this synthesis were conducted using the ARRA funds, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So these were very large, shovel-ready projects designed to increase local employment and economic impact. So that was a huge boost to the economy in the area during the time of project implementation. And we're looking at the ecosystem services resulting from these projects as well. Shoreline protection has been estimated to be the most valuable service provided by living shorelines. However, based on our synthesis of these projects in coastal Alabama, we're finding that this particular service is not quite matching up to the benefits that we're seeing in terms of oyster and fish production. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jacob to follow up with some more lessons learned and some outreach activities.
Thank you, Brittany. So we wrapped up all this data and we figured out kind of what was working and what was not working. And now we thought we need to use all of what we've learned. So we came up with these project fact sheets. And what you see here is kind of the front and the back of one fact sheet. And we wanted to be able to give a quick, easy summary that we could pass out to the general public, to officials from local municipalities, from the state legislators, to the federal senators and congressmen. I mean, we wanted to be able to do outreach, because as we know, kind of one of the biggest things to increase the acceptance and implementation of living shorelines is educating everyone, essentially. So, the first thing was with just kind of the general public and private landowners. We've gotten, people that know about them, we get good feedback from them. Just anecdotally, you see people fishing on our reefs. There's a couple of reefs in front of private landowners that they say they've never had better fishing in front of their property before. You see commercial crabbers putting out strings of traps in front of our reefs. And so the people that know about them generally accept them, and we get great feedback. There's also people that kind of know about the reefs but don't necessarily know that they're implemented by the Nature Conservancy or who they're implemented by, so we're trying to reach out to them. And so what we wanted to do was with these fact sheets is kind of first just a brief definite or description of the project. We know that people have short attention spans, so we didn't want to make this too wordy, so it's a very brief description. And then we kind of broke that down even further into these infographics, tell you what was there, when it was constructed, constructed, how well it's performed. A big one we like to point out is the volunteers. A lot of these projects were constructed with volunteers, and so we like to point that out. Then just also kind of the shoreline trend, how well we've increased protection. Also a little spot about salinity. A lot of our sites don't necessarily have oysters, but they have mussels, and part of that is explained by salinity. So we wanted to point that out. We also wanted to point out who our partners were and where the funding sources were. And this is kind of geared again towards not necessarily the public, but municipalities, as well as kind of the legislators and those officials that make decisions, and also funding sources to let them know, hey, you gave us this grant, this is what we did with it. And then maybe one of the most important things is kind of the future work. All this monitoring helps inform adaptive management. We realize that maybe these the bag shell reefs have broken down. They're not protecting the shoreline as much as we want them to anymore. So we need to go back and do something to restore the functionality of that living shoreline. So we want to highlight that, hey, we recognize this isn't doing 100% protection, but we're going to go back and we're securing the funds to go and fix it. So I'll kind of skip the first 5 bullets here and just go to the bottom one, because that's one of the most important lessons we've learned, is that monitoring is really important, and it's important for adaptive management, and it's important to do long-term monitoring. A lot of these projects are funded for monitoring for 2 years, and then after that, we secure funding or try to secure funding to do continued long-term monitoring. On a couple of our projects, for the first 2 years, you see great oyster settlement and growth. And if we had stopped there, that'd been 100% success. We wouldn't know we needed to go back and fix them. And after that 2 years, you start to see this oyster numbers decrease, and we only know that because we've done long-term monitoring. And the other thing is, plan your monitoring at the beginning. Make sure the data you're collecting is usable and useful. We collected all sorts of data that ended up kind of could not be used because we did a lot of sediment depth profiles behind the reefs, but we weren't always following the exact same transit line. And now people know that, but in the beginning, I mean, we didn't know that, and so none of that depth data can kind of be useful right now. And so it was kind of a waste of our time and our resources. So that was just, it's important to monitor, but it's important to monitor correctly. And there's lots of guides and standards and resources now to help you plan that. But it's one of the biggest lessons we learned. So that's all I've got. Thank you for, listening and paying attention, and I will pass this back to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you to you both. Brittany and Jacob, that was fantastic. So now we are going to open it up to questions. The questions are already starting to come in. Okay, one of the questions was, and I'm going to aim this one at Brittany first, and then Jacob, you are welcome to chime in. With future monitoring, what are you planning to add to your metrics? For example, sediment type, escarpment measurements, wave energy, elevation with benchmarkers, etc. In other words, what are you going to add to all this monitoring?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess that depends on the level of funding that is received. So, there are a lot of questions that came out of this data synthesis that have really highlighted some of the major gaps in data that we had. And as Jacob mentioned, we kind of did a lot of sediment depth profiling that, was collected for years, and nobody really had the resources to spend on analyzing those data. And by the time that came around, it wasn't until then that it was realized that, oh yeah, there were some problems in collecting this. Of course, we would love to, do some closer monitoring of wave energy in front of and behind the reef. If we could, get some specific funding to do some of that. And then, also with the reef blocks, there's a lot of adaptive management trying to go into figuring that out. So the first thing is, the Nature Conservancy already got some funding to look at, the area, the surface area, and if in the future we could do some more chemical measurements, to look and see if there's anything with the water chemistry going on in this particular location that's causing some of that shell dissolution. That would be great as well. One of the other things I'll say about monitoring data and kind of following up on these lessons learned that Jacob mentioned is, plan early, plan well at the beginning. And one of the things is for the reef balls, at the very beginning of some of these projects, they were pretty simple to lift out of the water and count the entire, oysters per reef ball was kind of the metric that this started out with. But as you can imagine, after some time in the water, they start to kind of crust together, and it becomes more difficult. And so then you're relying on kind of feeling around, and then it's like, okay, well, how much area are we actually measuring? So it would be, I would recommend make sure you know the exact area of a reef ball before you put them all in the water. And then the same with the reef bags as well. So at the very beginning, the sampling was done by kind of lifting a single bag off of the reef, dumping the contents into a bucket and kind of going through and, counting all of the oysters that were settled on those shells. But again, after time in the water, those become kind of encrusted together, and that becomes more difficult. And so then it turned into, counting the oysters on the top layer of the bag. And so just understanding your area versus your volume, and keeping notes of when things change is really important for these long-term data synthesis projects.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Any comments to add to that?
No, she covered it pretty well. I would say wave energy is a big one we'd like to look at, especially with adaptive management, just to know that right now our living shoreline is knocking down so much wave energy, but when we go back and do adaptive management, we actually are increasing that shoreline protection is kind of the biggest thing we're looking to do. And part of what prevents that right now is just cost of instrumentation. So there is a PhD student at Mississippi State University trying to help develop kind of a low-cost wave gauge. So we're following that closely and hoping that that'll work and that we can kind of even demo that technology at our site. So I would say the biggest thing we'd like to know is kind of wave energy.
Great. Okay, we have a ton of questions coming in. This is fantastic. Okay, so thank you to all of you who are writing in. I feel like I'm managing a talk show, which is kind of awesome. All right. Were piles of limestone rock tested for shoreline erosion control and oyster recruitment? So Brittany, I'll aim this one at you first.
So I guess none of our projects involved strict rock breakwater reefs or anything. We did have the HESCO cages that Jacob mentioned, so basically rocks contained within a large cage. And there are other projects in the area that are more kind of riprap along the shoreline. But for this synthesis, we were looking specifically at living shorelines projects that included some sort of oyster reef breakwater component. So no, it wasn't specifically tested within this project.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple here. So were either of the presenters involved at the time of Coffee Island project using bags, reef blocks, and reef balls? And were you aware if reef balls were deployed before the spill? I'm assuming that means the Deepwater Horizon. And was there any covering in oil and dispersants? Excuse me.
So I can answer.
Go for it, Jacob.
So no, neither of us were here when that project was implemented, but the spill happened kind of right before construction was going on. So the project was delayed, and I do not believe they were in the water when the spill happened. They were placed in the water after the spill. And as far as we know, they weren't covered or protected, but we also in our monitoring, didn't necessarily see oil on those reef balls.
So yeah, I'll follow up with that and say that some of the reefs had been constructed prior to the spill happening. So yeah, construction was kind of halted. And I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. I have it written down somewhere if you want to follow up with me, but that we know how many reefs, were done before, how many reefs were done after, and so that was all kind of considered in our data synthesis. And as far as I know, again, we did not see really any oil coverage. They did work hard to get some booms put out to protect these projects, basically because they're so close to the marsh. So there were a lot of boom placements to protect the marsh areas from the oil, and so those encompassed these reefs as well. So we didn't really have any oil damage directly on these reefs. Did that answer that question?
My apologies. I was on mute. I hate it when I do that. Yes, so that was fantastic. Thank you. And for anybody that has a question regarding specific aspects to this, I have since put up the emails for both of these presenters, and I would encourage you to follow up. So there was a question on whether your data are available, and if so, how folks can get it, and also a question as to how folks could perhaps share similar data down the road.
So great question. All of these data will be made available. We're finishing up the first manuscript from this project now, and the data will be formally released when that manuscript is finished. But they will be available on the Dauphin Island Sea Lab data repository site. So stay tuned. But all of those data will be available from all of the projects. And, we would be happy to try to, get more people, to get kind of a nice database of similar data together for all these projects. So I'd be happy to hear about what other projects people have and data, and whether they'd be willing to share, and how we can make all of that happen.
All right, folks, you heard her. Email her. and Jacob. So fantastic. That's great. It's always nice to have a more robust data set to compare. Okay, another question and a comment. Great presentation. In the synthesis, how did you deal with the differences in method and frequency of data collection by project site?
Another great question. So yeah, that was a big undertaking, and I'm not sure that we've figured it out in the best way, but it took about a year to kind of go through all of the original data, some of which had to be, I had to go back to the actual field data sheets to reconcile some discrepancies in the data files. We had to do a block of area calculations and conversations with people, calling people up and saying, hey, do you remember, 8 years ago when you went out to monitor this? Did something change from this month to this month? So that's why Jacob and I are both stressing, take really good notes. Even if you are doing, a 2 or 3 year project and you think it's, you're not going to continue monitoring it, just taking notes about, this time we went out and sampled, we were only able to, feel around the outside of the reef balls and not the outside and the inside. That became a really big source of data inconsistency that we spent a lot of time trying to figure out. So I think that we figured all that out. We got everything standardized to area. oysters per meter squared or whatnot. In terms of the time, that was a really difficult thing to do in terms of data analysis. So we were splitting things up by season, but then, as we all know, like even seasons are different between years. So this is when having more data such as wave energy or things like that could help kind of delineate, what we're seeing. We also were seeing big differences in the western shore of the bay versus the eastern shore of the bay, and kind of the northern part of the bay versus, Mississippi Sound. So we're splitting things up into different areas. In Alabama, the coast is pretty small. You can imagine doing this for a larger state or, for several states. This is going to bring in a lot of problems in terms of these big synthesis studies. So yeah, there were a lot of challenges in that, and good note taking is really important.
Okay, great. Thanks. Jacob, anything to add to that?
No.
All right.
That was very thorough.
Next question. As erosion reversal is a desired objective of these projects, do you think that a fill component between these structures and the shoreline would increase effectiveness of the projects?
Are
either of you going to take that one?
Yeah, I can. So, yes, we do think fill would be beneficial, and that happened at one of our sites, Pelican Point site. We did some fill, and that showed, obviously, because we added sand there, the erosion was less, and to do kind of a complete restoration, I think you'd want to fill it. I think the original thought when we put these in is that we would stop erosion and the marsh would naturally grow on its own and trap sediment. And that didn't happen. Part of the reason is that there's not a whole lot of sediment to trap. It's kind of a sediment-starved system. And we also just didn't knock down wave energy as much as we wanted to. So, yes, I think that doing a fill behind the reefs is a good idea, and that's something we're doing. We have another project called our Lightning Point project in Bayou La Battery, which will start construction next year, and that's going to be kind of the breakwaters and then go back behind it and fill in and restore it to kind of a historical shoreline. So it is something that kind of going forward, we'd like to do that at our projects, kind of build the breakwater and then fill in behind them.
Great, thank you. Brittany, anything to add or?
Yeah, just a little bit. So yeah, I guess it gets at kind of the point of the project. So obviously, if you're trying to protect, a coastal highway, or there's an island that's eroding away, obviously your best course of action is going to be to do every single component that you can. So build a breakwater, add fill, plant marsh, do all of that. I think for probably about half of these projects, maybe a third, they were very research oriented. So coming out of, academic research labs, and the goal was to test whether, installing, an oyster reef breakwater is going to by itself kind of, decrease erosion or, cause accretion. So yeah, it just depends on the goal of the project. And yeah, of course, adding sediment is going to be better for your shoreline.
Gotcha. It also adds some interesting complexity depending on the permitting and what the permitting regime is for your particular region.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a whole nother kettle of fish, pun intended. Okay, so so someone has a comment. It said, we had similar results with bag shell using bagged whelk in Delaware Bay, but learned that the configuration, double road, and position outside the mean low water line reduced the wave energy by 35% and accreted sand. Biodiversity was great and successional. We continued to monitor this and it will be their 4th year, and the reef is still showing really great signs of resilience. So it sounds like there's different types of setups that you can use depending on your wave energy and where you are. So that's the questions that we have, questions and comments from so far from participants. Folks are still obviously welcome to submit some others. We're kind of getting toward the end of the hour. Oh, we have another one that just came in. Any thoughts on comparing Mobile projects to other Gulf projects or living shorelines reef in the South Atlantic?
We would love to, if we could get, people to share data, and if we could get funding to, pay people to do all of this analysis. So, I guess those are our 2 roadblocks at this point. But, of course, it would be a dream to, compare this on a larger scale, such as across the Gulf or the whole Southeast.
I smell a dissertation in there somewhere.
Jacob, you ready for a PhD?
Not at the moment, no.
So I have a question that getting back to the societal and socioeconomic aspects of the metrics that you chose or you monitored, for lack of a better description. One of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of restoration professionals come out of school, grad school, whatever, and they're really familiar with all of the let's say the sciencey, hard sciencey, field sciencey parts of it, but don't necessarily have a really good background in how to incorporate those social aspects. And so did you encounter any challenges with that? And how did you pair with social scientists from the beginning, or how did that all come about? Because I know that has been a stumbling block for some folks. They say, oh, well, we would love to monitor X, Y, and Z, but we don't really know where to begin.
Yeah, I would say, reach out to your social scientists. A lot of institutions are pretty separated in terms of natural and social scientists, but, don't feel like you don't know anybody because you're stuck on one side of your campus, or you don't have a social scientist on your staff. So reach out to these people. They're very interested in getting involved with natural scientists. For us, in this particular project, it was pretty happenstance. So Stephen Cyphers was our main social scientist involved in this, and he was doing his PhD at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. So he was involved in these original projects and continued to go more toward the social route as he moved on from his PhD into his postdoc and faculty up at Northeastern. So we had a really nice kind of we just lucked out, I guess. And then when he moved up for his postdoc, he started working with Sean Grabowski, who is very much into the socioeconomics and ecosystem service valuations. So everything just kind of fell in place for us. But I would say if you, reach out, it can be pretty easy to kind of assemble a team with that diversity of background.
Good to know. Thank you. Another question. Do either of you happen to know studies of efficacy of living shorelines that are adjacent to hardened approaches? So that was one of the challenges in perception, for lack of a better description, where people were like, oh, well, if my neighbor has a seawall, I have to have a seawall. Would it be possible then to counter some of these perceptions with, field data and pilot projects that can show that a living shoreline will work? Or A, is that not true? Or B, does that just not exist yet?
In terms of whether it exists, I think we're getting there. There are several people kind of working on this comparison of hardened versus natural approaches. Rachel Gitman's one that comes to mind, as well as Stephen again. And in terms of whether it's true or not, I think there is a bit of truth in, if you're living along a section of coastline that is dominated by seawalls, you are going to face bigger problems than if you were living on a more natural coastline. So I think there is a little bit of truth to that perception of, well, if my neighbor has a seawall, I think I might need a seawall too. So I think the important thing to come out of that is when new like housing developments are being planned, kind of on that large scale, to really from that point, you know, make sure that no seawalls go up. You know, so right now, with some of the work I'm doing here in Texas, we're trying to, and across the Gulf, actually, we're trying to get in touch with developers, realtors, people like that, these other audiences that can kind of be more on the ground in terms of, you know, home ownership and landscape design and things like that, and try to prevent the implementation of seawalls from the beginning in areas where they're unnecessary.
Great. Thank you. And then I think we'll end with one is a question and a clarification. I think I heard a statement that I'm reading the question. I think I heard a statement that natural reefs protected better than manufactured. Are there actual natural reefs in this area? I think you were referring to the loose shell versus the engineered. Is that correct, Brittany?
Yes, that's correct. Just because we had such a diversity of project types, to aid kind of our synthesis and the way we broke things up and how we thought about things, we considered the material base. So if it was primarily composed of, you know, just oyster shell with very minimal man-made elements, then that was considered a natural category of reef versus, you know, concrete reef balls or the oyster castles or, you know, the rebar reef blocks where there's that big, you know, human design component. Those were considered, you know, in the engineered category strictly for the purposes of our synthesis.
Gotcha. Thank you. And one last question, then I think we'll have to wrap it up. When the bagged shell reefs were created, were they just shell alone, or was the spat seeded into the bags in advance? And the kind of the corollary to that, or does the system have a natural good set already?
Yeah, so I think we had one project, maybe two, Jacob, correct me if you remember the details, that were actually seeded. And that was like an earlier project, and we were finding that it wasn't making a big difference. And so the rest of the projects were not seeded. So it was, you know, mostly relying on natural recruitment.
Great. Thank you. And so with that, Jacob, any last words for this group?
No, I mean, thanks again for attending and giving us your time, and feel free to email me if you have any questions or if there's anything I can do to help you.
Wonderful. Brittany, any last words for the group?
No, thank you all so much.
All righty. So again, you have the slide up there. That's the information for myself, Brittany, and Jacob. And please mark your calendars for the next virtual gathering, which will be on October 17th. Jim Johannesson with Coastal Geologic Services will be talking about his many, many years up in the Pacific Northwest doing these sorts of projects. So on that note, thank you very, very much for contacting us and joining us. And by all means, please get in touch if you ever have any questions. Thanks and have a great day.